Welcome to the Property Voice Podcast, helping you to navigate safely through the world of property investing. Get the lowdown and updates, insights and outcomes on all matters property, with a splash of entertainment along the way. The Property Voice, a voice to trust among the crowd. Now, let's get started with your host, Richard Brown.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Property Voice podcast. My name is Richard Brown, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you join me on the show again today. Now, what goes up has to come down, they say. And this is certainly true with both economic cycles and specifically property cycles. The good years are usually quite straightforward for us, as time can fix many problems in property. House prices and rents will rise, and this can make a bad investment an acceptable one, or an average one a good one even. Inevitably though, understanding that there are these cycles also means we will face some harder times, when rising house prices and rents won't bail us out. And in fact, we can even run a severe risk of bankruptcy if we're not careful. So possibly a little bit doom and gloom episode this week, however an essential one as well, as we unpick some of the attributes of a recession that could cause us some trouble, and then by understanding this, adopt some good practices to help avoid these issues, undoing all of the hard work that we've been putting in over the years just at the time when a recession hits. Now, I'm joined on the show today by a property investor by the name of Ed Atkinson, who has invested in property through two recessions, giving him a little bit more miles on the clock than I intended to there, 2 recessions. And he now earns a significant part of his income through property. Now, Ed's written a paper called House of Cards, How Property Investors Can Survive Future Recessions, and he's also produced an accompanying simulation model in Excel to plot our own portfolio against the 5 major recessions of the past century. Now, Ed's work is aimed at property investors using leveraged, or higher levels of mortgage borrowing, if you like. And so these are the investors who are most at risk during a recession, as we shall see. So let's hear my chat with Ed in Property Chatter, and then we can pick up the thread again shortly.
Okay, so let's get on with this week's featured topic with Property Chatter.
Hi there everybody, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Ed Atkinson, who is an experienced property investor, and he will tell you himself his own experience and background. But in particular, I was very interested in a report that he wrote and an accompanying spreadsheet around surviving recessions in property cycles. So Ed, thanks very much for joining us on today's show. How are you?
Oh, thanks Richard. Yep, great.
Well, it's really, great for you to join me. And by the way, just so other people know, we're recording this on a Sunday evening, so even more thanks to you once again. But Ed, why don't you just start a little bit and just tell us a little bit about your background, so we can set some context for the listeners around this topic of surviving a recession.
Great. Well, I'm a civil engineer, but as regards property, I started as a young man wanting to get on the property ladder before my first owner-occupier place. So I did buy in 1986, and of course I've seen a couple of recessions since then. Mm-hmm. And from about 2000, my wife and I, we jumped in with both feet, property investing, and the portfolio grew massively after that.
And am I right in thinking that's certainly a mainstay of your income these days, is investing?
It is now, yes, that's right. Yeah. So it frees me up to pursue other dreams.
Yeah,
but, a good part of my week's on property. We self-manage, and then we're free to do other things, and we've got other businesses as well.
Absolutely, that's great. So you've survived a couple of recessions and lived to tell the tale, and I guess that you tell us about the motivation, if you like, for writing what I think the white paper or the PDF that you've got is called House of Cards, isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell me about the motivation behind that.
Well, I think I do see quite a weakness in the economy because of us buy-to-let investors, and the recession we've just had has been the mildest one of the lot, which I think is giving us a full sense of how easy it is.
Mm.
And it could be that if a normal kind of recession comes around next, there'll be almost a structural imbalance in the economy caused by us buy-to-let investors. So if a significant number of us do end up with repossessed properties, that will affect the whole market, and the whole thing will kind of spiral downwards in a unstable way that previous recessions haven't had quite so much. So it's what I'm trying to get out is the message that this kind of normal, reasonably high gearing that property investors do can be organised in such a way as to get you ready for a recession, and not be part of the problem, but to be able to almost like smooth it out by buying up property in a recession to kind of keep the market going, which investors will do when probably owner-occupiers won't be around.
Mm-hmm.
So I just feel if we as a community have got this together, we can be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Yeah, and I think to distinguish, I've read your paper, obviously, and it's aimed primarily at the higher leveraged property investor, because that's probably where the most danger is going to lie. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. So just quickly then, what we talk about recessions. What is the definition of recession, and how many have we seen? Let's say in the last century. In other words, what have you focused in on your paper? We probably had a couple of minor blips, but you already know the answer, I'm sure.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Well, recessions are normally defined in terms of GDP, and there have been 5 over the last century where GDP has dropped by a lot, sort of 5% or so, and a few little blips, 56 and 65 or something like that, where it was only less than 1%, but they were technical recessions from the point of view of a certain number of quarters with falling GDP. But the overall fall from before the recession to its trough was only a fraction of a percent.
So the big ones, the big 5 are?
1930, 1973, 1980, 1990, and of course 2008.
Yeah, and of course we always only remember the last one, don't we? 2008.
Yes, that's right.
So, but from your analysis, are there any? Probably a 2-part question. Are there any common characteristics across all 5 of those major recessions? And indeed, are there any characteristics which might be different, either in one or some of those 5?
Well, the big characteristic in all of them is that house prices drop in recessions. And I think we could say that there is a gentle rise in rents as well through all recessions. So those, you could say, are the themes that are common. But in the analysis, there were 3 recessions that stood out. Out of these 5, there was a 3 and a 2. So the 3 are all in the 20-year period from 1973 up to 1990. So 73, 80, and 1990, and they were all high interest rate recessions. So the interest rates were around 10-12%, would you believe, in those 3 recessions, and leading up to them as well. And 1930, the interest rate was quite similar to the one we just had. It started around 5% leading up to the recession, and then it dropped. It dropped down to I think 3% or so as the recession got going, and equally R1 in 2008, the interest rates dropped as the recession got going, which was in contrast to the other 3.
Yeah, so in other words, it's not like a one-size-fits-all pattern here, is there? There's a couple of groupings at least. There's the 3, the grouping of 3 and the grouping of 2. But even the grouping of 3 looks at probably a little bit, it looks like a 20-year outlier period to some extent, doesn't it, with that such high interest rates?
Yes, when you look at it from the history of Bank of England interest rates, going back to 1694, that 20 years, it was like nothing else. And we've gone back a bit to normal since. Obviously, since 2008, the very low interest rate is equally anonymous.
Yeah, it is, yeah. Because I think the long-run average of interest rates is about 5%, isn't it? Something like that order?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It didn't even get above 7% till the 60s, and then 73 onwards, it was at this ridiculous 12, 14%, that sort of thing, in the recessions.
And you mentioned interest rates and house prices and rents and GDP, which is a measure of economic growth. I think the other big one to kind of call out is inflation, isn't it, maybe?
Yes. I'm not sure. Well, that obviously affects things like your repairs and maybe your management fees to a degree, but I think as a property investor, it's not quite such a big issue.
It's more house price and rents inflation than general inflation that we're interested in, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Rent inflation and house price inflation, definitely.
Excellent. Okay, great. And so I guess, the leading question is, so what are the main reasons why property investors in particular could struggle as a result of facing a recession?
Well, it's all about interest rate to begin with. Mm-hmm. And if you find that interest rates do go up, and that is what's prompted the recession, which is seems to be part of what's going on in those 73, 18, 90 recessions, then your portfolio is in negative cash flow. So that's the first thing that goes wrong. Mm-hmm. The second thing that goes wrong is that your other resources, either other income or a kind of backup fund or kind of a cushion of cash to allow yourself to ride out losing money on your portfolio for a few years. That's the second stage. If that runs out, then you hit the stage where you aren't able to keep up with your mortgage repayments, and that's when you have a repossession. And in a recession, the house prices will almost certainly have gone down, so you might well be in negative equity. So if you're forced to sell, so the forced sale situation combined with the lowering of prices means you could easily end up still owing the bank money, and then they'll want you to sell the next property and then the next property, and the whole thing could fall down like a house of cards, which is why
hence your name.
It's been called that.
Yeah, it's kind of an ever-decreasing circle to some extent, isn't it? That your negative cash flow on individual properties and the portfolio overall. Then you look at your cash reserves, and once they deplete, then you have to then try and cash in your properties to pay down debts, and it just keeps going until eventually you've got nothing left, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. And that's the thing to avoid.
They're the things to avoid.
Even you can actually organise yourself such that even if you get to that third stage and having a forced sale, you can still rescue the situation if you organise things correctly.
Yeah, so that's really where I wanted to get to, the meat of the matter, actually, isn't it? Because you've done the analysis, you've highlighted what the key risks are going to be, these three events, in ever-decreasing degrees of seriousness, I suppose. So what can we do about it? What are the sort of top tips that we can do to your words, organise ourselves?
Well, I think avoiding being in negative cash flow over the portfolio is probably the sort of thing that you'd be familiar with in all your, in other podcasts you've done.
Yeah.
So it's all the normal things about kind of not buying a property based just on its long-term growth. You're also looking at it for just to have a good yield from it anyway. Those kind of issues. Mm-hmm. And then there's a few little things on the margins that the kind of properties which are going to suffer a drop in rent tend to be the posher sort of ones. Everyone's got to live somewhere, and if there's a recession coming, then you're going to maybe hunker down a bit. and if you're in rented, you'll leave your lovely posh place with its gold taps and move to something a little bit more standard. So it'll be people trying to let out on the luxury end of the market who might well hit negative cash flow first. But I reckon that's, unless you want to add anything to that from your experience.
No, I think, in general terms, I actually support exactly what you said, but I think a lot of people, they get focused on investing in property on house price growth, which is capital growth. And you make the point really well that it's actually about preserving the cash flow, and which is of primary importance. And I think, as you say, there's some things around the margin which contribute to that, but that's definitely the first step, isn't it, to invest primarily for cash flow rather than necessarily capital growth.
Well, just be aware of it, I'd say.
Yeah.
I mean, all my properties are pretty well in the south, and so yields are lower here, but cash flow is good. So, but I'm just being aware that because of that, I need to be extra vigilant with my cash flow in a recession.
Yeah, and I think there's a distinction I would just make. The difference is between cash flow and yield. So positive cash flow does not necessarily mean, doesn't always go with high yield. So that's probably getting a bit technical. But I think the point is that you've got enough money each month to pay your outgoings is your first rule.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So not being too highly geared is one way of doing it, but I've got things to say on that sort of further down the line.
So that's the first one.
So the second one is if you are in negative cash flow, it's still not a disaster. There is the first protocol is to have a reserve fund, and that could be, I mean, I've heard of 20%, and I would have thought normally it'd be quite a bit less than that to have, that you could realistically you could have. So I'd say if you are going to be geared, it is worth actually gearing quite high, but then putting money into a reserve fund rather than keeping back on the gearing and having no cash reserves at all. I think that's more dangerous.
Yeah. So just clarify, the 20% is 20% of.
Well, I'm assuming this 20% I heard about was of the portfolio value at purchase, but I might be.
Yeah, no, it's just that would be a safe bet, wouldn't it? 20% of the portfolio value at any one point in time. Yeah,
I mean, I can't imagine that ever coming across if you at that level of safety.
Yeah. But a more realistic level, or have you modelled a safer level that is below that?
Well, I think each person has their own circumstances, and that's why I did this spreadsheet.
Yeah, so we'll come to the spreadsheet, but generally speaking, having the reserve funds, so let's get those out. That's the second step.
Yes, there's lots to be added that I'm sure you could say better than me on alternative source of income.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, you don't need to have this cash reserve fund actually as cash. If you've got an agreed drawdown facility on one of your mortgages or your home mortgage, that you don't need to go back and get permission in a recession, then that is effectively the same as a cash reserve fund.
Yeah. Could even be a credit card.
So that could all that
well, I wouldn't recommend it, but it could be. And so there's your first two. Is there a third?
Yes, the third is if you are in a forced sale situation, so all your cash reserves are gone, your alternative source of income can't cope, and you have to let the bank know that you're not going to be able to pay the mortgage, then you're in a forced sale situation, but that isn't necessarily a disaster yet, because if you've got a portfolio and you've got one or two properties with very little gearing and high gearing on all the other properties, then you can sell the properties with the low gearing, and you'll be then actually able to get money out of the deal rather than passing on the debt to the next property, and then you'll be able to sort of ride out the rest of the session that way.
That's interesting. So in other words, not just having a blanket approach to your loan to value, but basically targeting one or two properties to maybe have better equity concentration, which will allow you a rapid exit if you needed one. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So there's the three. So I guess cash, then a liquidity, access to liquidity, and then a little bit of organization so that you can do let's say a controlled forced sale and release equity quickly in the worst case scenario. So there's the sort of research, there's the sort of principles, the top three at least, and I know your paper goes into more detail. But you've also developed this model, as you kind of alluded to, didn't you, just now, this Excel model. I'm very intrigued with that. In fact, I've had a really nice play with that as we were talking about before we got into recording. But tell us a little bit about the model that you've developed and what it does.
Well, it's quite fun, I hope. You put in your portfolio figures and, the mortgages and rents and values and all the rest of it. And then it tells you what would happen if suddenly the 1930 recession hit next year, or the 1973 recession. So all these recessions, and you see which ones you survive and which ones you go belly up in. And then if you've got some more time, you can put in your portfolio property by property, and then see how you can juggle it, selling one in 1973 and sell the next one in 1975, and see if you can keep yourself afloat that way. Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of tool to play around with, and just to see how vulnerable you are to the kind of recessions that have happened in the past.
Yeah,
you can also
go ahead. Sorry.
You can also put in a recession that's like a guess for what the next one might well be, and adjust it, and again do lots of trial and error that way.
I love this. I mean, we talk, so it's a simulation tool. It's playing the what if game, and I think it's great that you can try different scenarios out before you have to live through them in reality. So I think it's tremendous what you did, and as I say, I already had a lot of fun. I was doing, there was a lot of green. I'm happy to say that came out when I did mine. For anybody who's not seen it yet, green is good in some of the results, but. I think that's tremendous what you did there, and I think a lot of our listeners will welcome having a read of your paper and also a little play around with your spreadsheet. But I guess can I just ask, generally speaking, Ed, would you be prepared to write a guest post on the Property Voice for us around this topic, how to survive a recession?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I'll give that a go.
That'd be brilliant. I think the other thing is, we've probably warmed up the listeners now to hear a bit more about your paper and indeed the spreadsheet. Are you happy for us to share that with listeners?
I think so. I do need to just quickly check some partners how I developed it. I would imagine they wouldn't have a problem. And I'll whack it over.
That'd be great. What I'll say then is, if anyone wants to gain access to that, just drop us an email, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net, and I'll direct you to Ed, or where you can get copies of the report and indeed the spreadsheet. That'd be great. And I'm sure. I mean, I had a lot of fun playing with the spreadsheet. Obviously, it was fascinating to read the paper as well, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would be really interested to do so. So Ed, thanks so much really for putting that together. It's a great service to everyone out there, and if we can spread the word, hopefully, as you say, then we're not going to be a cause of the problem when the next one hits.
Yeah. Can I just add something?
Yeah, by all means.
I've heard that great talk you did with, is it Akhil Patel?
Yeah.
And then your 6 kind of things to watch, and I'd imagine that we are able to know when a recession's coming, based on the 18-year cycle and just watching the market, and just not buying in the years leading up to a recession is probably just enough to survive it.
That one step alone. Yeah,
just that one step of saying avoiding buying within 3 years of recession. And maybe it's impossible with the crystal ball, but it is that easy, just sort of not to get caught up in the hype and increase your drawdown on mortgages and buying new property and getting yourself geared up to the limit just as recession is about to happen. If you can avoid all that, that's probably enough.
Yeah, that's great. I think I certainly believe in, getting educated and, getting switched on to, that's why I've got this series, obviously, about cycles, having a broad understanding of property cycles, economic cycles, and some of the indicators that we can watch out for. And, this is just a real practical application, because what you've shown with your work, Ed, is that if we go through recession and we're not properly, set up, then it is a house of cards. Potentially it could come all crashing down for us personally, and of course then there's a wider social impact as well, social and economic impact. So if we do have more awareness, and thanks for pointing out the 18-year cycle and the interview and the work we're doing, Akil and I together, and indeed the 6 key areas that we can look out for, which give us a clue to what's coming downstream, we can potentially avoid it, or at least lessen the blow, let's say, when it happens. Brilliant. Well, I probably need to draw it a close just to make sure we can get it into the format. But I just want to say thanks so much for joining me, and really do appreciate, especially being a Sunday evening and me reaching out to you quite short notice. So, hats off to you, and indeed for preparing this work and sharing it so freely that you have done. I'm sure that's going to benefit an awful lot of property investors out there and save a lot of people from a lot of pain. Great.
Well, if you could do all you can to get the message out. Brilliant.
I will certainly try. Thanks once again, Ed, and we'll be in touch soon with the blog post.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
You're
Cheers.
welcome. Bye for now. I have to say that Ed was very gracious in, first of all, accepting my invitation to come on the show this week at short notice, and then on a Sunday evening as well, where we actually managed to get a time where we could speak. So it definitely shows his passion for the subject, and also his willingness to help spread the message for all of our benefit, I would say. I guess if I were to summarize his vicious spiral, as I'm going to refer to it, those are my words rather than his, during a recession, we're faced with the following potential threats. The first one is the threat of negative cash flow. So this could happen where interest rates increase and our mortgage payments obviously are increasing, and that there's a potential squeeze on our rental income as well, resulting in our portfolio, whether it's across the piece or individual properties suffering, to produce negative cash flow. The second point would be, once the cash flow is negative, that we end up exhausting any cash reserves or supplementary income that we might have to be able to support the negative cash flow position that arises from the first point. And I guess the house of cards all comes tumbling down is if those first two more cash-based situations give rise to us having to sell properties on a forced sale basis, as they call it, which could lead from pressure from lenders as we fall into arrears and default, and we end up selling at a discount, potentially with a raft of extra fees being thrown in. So I guess I'm calling it death by 1,000 cuts like experience as we lurch from one catastrophe to the next until finally we have no portfolio left, or could even face bankruptcy at the extreme, as others certainly have done in the past. So sorry it sounds a bit doom and gloom and pessimistic, but there is a way that we can protect ourselves. And of course, if we protect ourselves defensively through recession, then it should serve us well opportunistically as well, either during the recession times or indeed during the good times as well. So Ed has a list of about 10 tips to apply in order to avoid this disaster striking in his paper, as I mentioned, A House of Cards. But here is his top 3. The first is to ensure that we invest with a positive cash flow across the portfolio. I think he was alluding to the fact that we could potentially have some individual properties which are not necessarily cash flow positive, as long as the overall portfolio is cash flow positive. So that maybe allows us to carry the odd one. So that's quite a big call out really for a diverse approach to our portfolio investing. I probably would label it invest for cash flow rather than capital appreciation. But I guess on reflection, we could have a diverse approach and have definitely some high yield or at least high cash flow assets in there as well. Equally, he made the point that we should aim to have a cash reserve fund, set some cash aside ready to tide us over in those difficult times, and I certainly agree with that point, generally speaking, in any case. And third of all, if we were to concentrate our equity into one or two properties rather than necessarily spread it about evenly, and I thought that was quite a good point, because that would allow us rather quicker access to one or two properties where there's more equity involved, should we need to get hold of the money quicker, because we might find ourselves with a little bit of equity spread across each property and just basically not being able to get out of the mess that we're in because there isn't sufficient money to realise. But he also had a bonus tip, if you like, of avoiding investing during the 2 to 3 years leading up to a recession, which is also known as the winner's curse, if you remember from our discussion with Akil Patel on the 18-year property cycle just a couple of weeks ago in this series. Now, personally speaking, I agree with a lot of what Ed was saying, and indeed I've been advocating much of this advice for quite some time, both on the blog and indeed here on the podcast. So in my experience though, I guess what I've learned is there's two main killers of a business, which would include a property portfolio business, and they are a lack of cash and or liquidity. And if we can avoid negative cash flow and poor liquidity, then we should be well positioned to survive most downturns well. These are slightly different, however, and let's just have a look at that for a moment. Cash is literally cash funds available in the bank that we can access immediately, or at least close to immediately. And this is why Ed talked about ensuring positive cash flow across our portfolio, and also in having a reserve fund. That's all about cash. Liquidity, on the other hand, is having access to what I would call cash equivalent resources in a reasonable time period. So it could be assets that we could sell. We talked about having some equity in one or two properties that we could sell potentially relatively quickly, so it's not immediate, but relatively quickly. It could be having additional borrowing facilities that we could call upon, which Ed mentioned in the interview, and indeed I would certainly think that would be, if we can do that, be great. An offset mortgage, for example, on a home would be an example of that. Even credit cards, but that's obviously at a higher interest rate and really only for essential last resort purposes, I would suggest. Or alternatively, and I think the thing I was really dwelling on the most was having alternative income streams. I think probably, as I was really reflecting on all of this, I think if we're over-reliant on the income from the property portfolio and don't have alternative sources of income or resources we could call upon, then we're probably in the most vulnerable position of all, I would suggest, in the hard times or periods of recession. So building up alternative income streams would serve us well. So whether that's from a job to until the portfolio is really robust, or alternative business streams and revenue streams along the side of our property portfolio as well would be what I would suggest. So therefore, by implementing a plan that considers both cash and liquidity, we can put measures in place to ensure our survival during those harder times, almost I would say, regardless of what happens in the economy. It's almost, it's not a guarantee, it's almost. However, the bonus tip is also extremely important, and it kind of plays on what we're talking about quite a lot over these last few weeks, and that is having an awareness of some of the basic economic principles in property, such as the 18-year property cycle, and also the 6 key factors that affect house prices, as we discussed over the last 2 episodes in the series. Now, we don't need to become full-blown economists or anything like that. We just need to be aware of some of the warning signs. And as such, we could just avoid being that lemming diving off the cliff in the winner's curse phase of the property cycle, if you remember that. So today's theme, I guess, is something of a defensive measure. How to survive is hardly the most inspiring of titles after all, is it? However, in order to enjoy the highs and the good times, we also, no doubt have to ensure that we're in great shape for those inevitable troughs as they arise as well. Now, as we mentioned during the interview, Ed will be making a guest contribution to our blog in the near future. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get hold of a copy of his paper, A House of Cards, and the excellent Excel spreadsheet, or I'm going to call the recession simulation model for yourself, then just drop me an email, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net, and I'll make sure that the details of how to get hold of those are sent across to you. We just need to determine where exactly they're going to be held, which is why I'm asking you to email in. So thanks once again to Ed, but right now it's time for Your Voice.
Up next is Your Voice. It's all about you and your property world.
So back to Your Voice then, and this week we have another 5-star review. This time it comes from BB in Property, who says, 5 stars, fills the void. This podcast series plugs the gap in the learning resources for property investors neatly. Not an interview-based show, but sometimes snippets from industry subject matter experts. Not a news service, which would be the equivalent of chip-wrap newspaper, but instead a more in-depth look into specific topics that property investors want to know about. Some nice features too, like the production quality and the glamorous assistant Kaza, do make it stand out in the crowd. Worth subscribing. Well, thank you very much, BB in Property rather. Sorry that we have not had Kaza for quite a while now, but we didn't find that many people, I have to say, such as you, that seem to want her to stay on the show, I'm afraid. So, but if there are Kaza fans out there, and you or indeed others want to start a lobby group to get her back on the show, let's hear from you. In the meantime, though, maybe we'll just leave it be. So we really do appreciate the reviews, I have to say, because it does help us to spread the word. So please, if I could encourage you, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes. That would be fantastic if you could do that. But meanwhile, you can also get involved in the Your Voice segment by sending in your questions or your stories. Why not leave us a voicemail? We have a speak pipe facility on the website. You don't need to make a phone call. You can literally speak through your computer. So head over to thepropertyvoice.net and you can leave us a voicemail if you'd like. But next up, we have the shout out.
And now, where you can go for more great resources with the shout out.
Okay, so I'm going to make a promise to you. This will be one final push as far as my 10K fundraising run is concerned, okay? So if you just indulge me very briefly here, I'll just get it out of the way and then we can move on forever. Needless to say, I did it. Last Saturday, I managed to brave the wind and the rain, and I ran the 10K with my brother-in-law in a respectable time of 56 minutes and 19 seconds. Well, I'm saying it's respectable anyway. You'll have to judge for yourself whether you think it is. But I had a goal of beating 1 hour, so I managed to do that. So I'm very, very happy about that end result. I have to say it was a little bit tougher that morning than I was expecting for some reason. I probably wasn't feeling that great. I hadn't had the best night of sleep, having stayed up late to watch the Bond premiere. And yeah, I don't know, there was something just not right. It was windy, it was raining, but there you go. I managed to get it done. So I've held up my end of the bargain. I've completed it and I'm very happy to report. So there we go. It'd be great though if you would be willing to support the fundraising effort. If you have not done so already. So please just head over to the website, thepropertyvoice.net, and search for the post that's called Giving in Action, Supporting an Amazonian School. And that'll tell you all of the backstory and all of the details of how you can get involved and support this cause. It's worth a read in any case, because these kids in the middle of nowhere, really, in the rainforest, were very inspirational, and they certainly touched me with their stories and their hopes for the future, in fact. So there we go. So I guess if I'm to pick a resource that I'd like to share with you this week, it would have to be justgiving.com, which is a great site to get involved and to support worthy causes, or for one of your own, just as I did. So check it out and see what other well-deserving causes there are that would benefit from maybe just a week's abstinence from your regular Starbucks or Costa Coffee visit to support them instead. So it doesn't really take a lot to make a difference in people's lives. Justgiving.com, generally speaking. Obviously, I've got my own site over there, which is supporting the Amazonian School, but there's plenty of others as well to get involved with. Okay, so that about wraps things up for another week then. By all means, feel free to drop me an email personally, as always, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net. And as always, the show notes will be over at the website, thepropertyvoice.net. And there we have it, and in our customary style now, all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening once again, and until next time on the Property Voice podcast, it's ciao ciao.
thank you for listening today. Now head over to thepropertyvoice.net for more inspirational content and get updates through our mailing list. Join us next time on the Property Voice podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate us on iTunes.